Stuart, thank you very much indeed for taking time to be part of this podcast. And I really do making time because you're an incredibly busy guy and we know each other in different areas. And I think you've got a really interesting story in how those areas weave together.
Mm.
You have, by way of an introduction, and you can please do give more clarity, you were a very, very small business and you've grown that business to be hugely successful. Then you've sold that business. You are
Yep.
now leading one of the largest businesses in the world. BDO is one of the biggest brands in the world. And so you have actually a unique insight as somebody who's managed a small business, seen it grow, now manages a very large business. But you're not just about business. I know you're really active on a lot of social areas,
Mm.
equality and diversity. You've been
Yep.
the chairman of a local rowing club at a time of
Yep.
massive growth, significant change, and some outstanding results. And so it's really interesting. All of my conversations are sort of ad hoc, but there is there appears to be a pattern here about
Mm.
leadership and growth and what you're doing. But
Mm.
what's really interesting is very often the people that are really good at small businesses are actually seldom that great at large businesses. And I'm wondering how you have grown, how your perceptions have changed, what that path is, because of course, my impression of your journey may be completely different from yours. So I'm just interested in that.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Um, I said obviously BDO is a jurisdictional franchise business. So in actual fact, in the sort of the Jersey business also incorporates C5. So I work across the BDO and C5 brands, which is is interesting because it brings new dynamics. But it's quite interesting. But my background as well, I spent a lot of time working with the likes of Deutsche Bank in my formative years, and as a consultant working with some of the larger organisations, like Barclays. Some of my work there is quite well known. So I've always had this small business whilst working for large businesses sort of dichotomy. So it's actually quite interesting running a small business because you get to do everything. I remember my first day, and I think we have to try and bring some of these things down to earth. I remember we had our first small office, our first we set up the business, had our first engagements and all that sort of stuff. And I had to send out the statement of works. So my first act as a business owner was actually to walk to Caxton's and buy printer paper. And now I am traipsing across town with a box of paper. And then all of a sudden you can be working with some strikes, quite strategic projects for bearings in the city, Barclays, and things like that. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey, but through it really is a desire to progress myself, the team, the business I'm working for. And in fact, in all the things I've done, that's the core tenet. How do we drive things forward, and how do we make things better tomorrow than they are today, in whatever that might be?
Yeah, the interesting thing about that is that the impression I get of you perhaps is almost as much as an educator as a
Mm.
leader. And I know that one of your original businesses, Maiden, which is
Knowledge, advice, delivery. That was right. That was
knowledge
our
advice
sort of
delivery.
moniker.
So there is something there about that passion for sharing information.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'll tell it almost by way of a story because I remember doing some work in Guernsey for close fund services, and the most outstanding sort of manager in that business was actually somebody who had come from as a golf coach, not a fund administrator sort of or a fund manager. So a very different background, and he described it quite succinctly that his job was to ensure that everybody in his team was working at their best,
Mhm.
and that if he was unable to explain something, he had made a mistake and not the individual. So for me, what I find quite interesting is if you know how to do something,
Mhm.
I can give that knowledge away freely to 10, 20, 100 people. You know,
Mhm.
it my by helping someone and explaining something, you don't lose it yourself.
Mhm.
You've helped someone get better. And even if only two of those 10 give you something in return, well, you've now got more things. And
Mhm.
I find the compound effect of working on change, working on challenging things, talking to people, hearing their perspective, understanding their insight, the amount of insight knowledge you pick up over time is extraordinary. And so I think it's important we take an open-minded, slightly selfless view
Mhm.
on knowledge, because it's the only way you can help people and drive change. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd certainly subscribe to that. But what I'd like to explore then a little bit is that type of knowledge. Now, I can see two ends of the spectrum, and I suspect
Mm.
the answer is somewhere in the middle. But certainly, if we look at 1960s, 1970s management and leadership,
Mhm.
we would say that we highly value cognitive and academic skills,
Yep.
and the ruling classes were well educated.
Yep.
Look at Henry Ford's Model T line. Most of those guys were illiterate and they were
Hmm.
very grateful for a job. Um, we now live in a world where actually the next generation is probably brighter, better educated, more motivated, more discerning than the
Yep.
older generation. And we live in a world where, because there are now nearly 8 billion of us, okay, so that's a 16-fold increase since pre-World War One. That's a
Hmm.
significant amount of growth in a short amount of time. There is more specialism.
Yep.
And I'm interested, and arguably I've got a vested interest in this, but as a consultant, I'm interested in this thing, breadth versus depth in the modern
So I
age.
love this debate, and I've had this debate with myself my entire career, because
Mhm.
by its nature, I'm more of a generalist than a specialist. So the way I describe it, and if I think about when we helped take Barclays International through ring fencing to keep the sort of project simple, I ran a very broad team that worked across tax, legal, tech,
Mhm.
ops, compliance, all of these different fields. And I described my role as the program lead as almost playing centre midfield. My job wasn't, in actual fact, it's physically impossible to be better than the legal
Mhm.
lead at law.
Mhm.
So my job wasn't to be better than her at law. My job was to understand and help her understand the impacts of the words we were writing to and agreeing to on other streams.
Mhm.
And so, we would sit there with the transitional services agreement, and I would be sat there as a program lead, agreeing or not agreeing to the things that could be delivered, and
Mhm.
then having to go to the technology teams and drive it, but also understand the technology stream sufficiently well so that I could also be reasonable and fair in front of the other teams. So my job was to understand when somebody in operations said, came up with a challenge, that I would go, oh crikey, that's a regulatory breach. If we went live like that, that problem would be a breach. So clearly there's something we have to fix. So my job was always to skate across the top, and be, as my friend called it, the third best in every position, which is about what centre midfield is. Hence, you have to play attack and defence. And if you look through my career, um, I'm intellectually curious and I'm bored easily. Um, but I like to understand the world. And if you look at my educational backgrounds, one of my most pivotal moments in my career was actually when my manager at the time suggested, I was asking how do I get on in my career. I'm 19 years old, and he suggested I could do a lot worse than going to get qualified in my job.
Mhm.
I didn't know that such a thing existed, so off I went. And then all of a sudden, 10, 14 years later, I've done, my banking exams, my degree, my postgrad, my MBA, and so I've done an awful lot of work in a broad range of areas. And not not one of them sufficiently interest me enough, if you like, to dedicate my sole being to it. However, when being a business owner and being a manager of people, having that broad understanding and breadth means that when I speak to the FD, I've got sufficient understanding to ask good questions and understand what they're getting at and how it impacts the balance sheet and all those good things. But I'm probably more versed than that person in some other area of the business. Do you see what I mean? And understanding those impacts and therefore how to drive holistic change, because change and transformation isn't just one area. It's how do we get the whole machine to be a bit better and a bit faster and a bit slicker.
Everything you says resonates with me, but I wonder if that's a function, one, I mean, I'm older than you, but our generation, not necessarily our age, but our generation. But maybe also, having grown a small business where you do literally do everything on your own, or maybe there's a team of 3 or 4 of
Yeah.
you, so you have to be massively cross-functional to work well as a team. Do you find now that you're in a much larger organization, does your management and leadership style change as a consequence of literally having more staff who can specialize?
Yeah, and I think that's so. I think it's always the most important thing I think you can do as a leader is to enable others to be their best or better selves,
Mm.
whatever that situation is. And so if I look at my role now, I work across marketing, sales, account management, commercial control. I do a lot of proposition design and things like this. Now, it's physically impossible for one person to do all of that clearly. So what are our guiding stars? What are the things that we are really doubling down on? What are the important key messages? What are the sectors? What are the propositions that we're going to push hard so that we as a business can outperform? And some of those involves choices, frankly, but a lot of it is more about aligning activity to those key processes, key projects, which are aligned to the key outcomes you want. And I think you have to be choiceful in what you do, but most importantly, it's about enabling others. I can't stress that enough. My job is not now to be twice as good as I was. That's kind of not possible. My job is to how do we get 100 people to be 5% better? Do you know what I mean?
And I think that, I mean, it definitely resonated with me when you were saying your job isn't necessarily to make people twice as good as you, or for you to be twice as good. I'm reflecting we have a mutual interest in rowing, and there's no way I'm going to be twice as good as I used to be.
Yes, exactly. Likewise.
So I think that's interesting, but I also think we've talked actually quite a lot about your skill set, your experience, and how you've grown. So we could argue that's all supply side.
Yep.
How do you think the demand side has changed? How has the market changed? Because I'm a child, effectively a Thatcher. I think
Yep. Likewise.
the world is very different now.
Yes. So I do think a little bit too much is made of the whole Gen X, Y, Z sort of discussions. However, at the same time, there is some truth in it. Yeah. And your point economically, about the intergenerational shift of, needing to work to survive, job for life, things like that, those have clearly happened. And the caricature, the anecdote I'll use to show how things have shifted. When I did my computer studies GCSE 30 years ago, I had to write the file and retrieval system, saving information to floppy disks and retrieving it. Now, young men and women are graduating from, high profile universities, playing around with large language models and data sets on a scale that we couldn't have conceived 30 years ago. But so I think the capabilities of technology have massively changed. I think economically, there is a general shift in the ways of working within an organization. And I think there's a greater emphasis on providing empowerment, providing opportunities for growth, and working in a less strict way. And I mean removing arbitrary rules. Why 9 to 5? Yeah. I'm an early bird. I get up, I come in at 7, and I go rowing in the early evening at 4, because that works better for me. And I think there's a greater expectation of a fairer, more flexible operating environment. We just need to take that on board, frankly. But also, I don't think the fundamentals have changed. It's, for me, part of my role as one of the senior leaders is providing opportunity for people within an area they wish to grow in, that also happens to align with roughly what we're trying to do with clients.
So, I mean, this sounds like a slightly baited question, but I'm interested in how you might unpack it. I mean, there's a good business argument to be a flexible employer because it makes people more productive.
Yeah.
But actually, I also get this point that it's possibly not about productivity, but a deep sense of fairness. And you are a great advocate for equality and diversity. And I suspect it isn't about productivity. It is a deep concern for the human, for the person.
So that's interesting. There's two ways to pack that. So I guess philosophically, I take a fairly stoic view of things, and I strive to be fair. I strive to make a sort of courageous, wise, more temperate decisions. I mean, no one's perfect. Take action, reflect. All of those things I think are good core principles.
And is that something you've always had?
For a very long time, yes, very long time now. Yeah. Now you don't necessarily grow up with it, but one of the things I've done a lot of learning around, and part of it was to understand myself. But I've read an awful lot about how the human brain works, its foibles, the cognitive errors it makes. We know if we are in an environment we're not trusted, we will make different decisions than we will in an environment where we're trusted or we feel psychologically safe. So, understanding those things, I try to create an environment where I'm psychologically safe, or my team are psychologically safe. Yeah. So if we go back to things, I think there's two things, because you were asking me about sort of approach to leadership and a very human thing and a very human approach to it. And I think there's two things, because one part of it comes from an understanding of mental health, and having myself once or twice been in some very, very dark places. So whenever I'm faced with a situation and somebody has acted outside of the norms, and you've taken a step back, my first point of call is go, okay, what's gone wrong in their life to have caused them to act in that way, because that's not like them. And I think if you go back to the point we were starting to talk about psychological safety, if you try to be kind in the first instance, if you try to create an environment where you're approachable, if you don't shoot the messenger. I mean, the whole point about psychological safety is it's well known in leadership that it allows people to perform because they're willing to innovate, make mistakes, come to you with problems. And clearly, if you shoot the messenger, that stops, and that's very, very detrimental. And I always take the view that if somebody has come to you with a problem, that's taken courage on their part, and they are trusting you with that problem, whatever it is. It might be a work thing, it might be a personal thing. And so I think if you want a team to outperform, the first thing you have to do is build that environment of trust and psychological safety, because without it, humans don't function very well.
And that's a lovely segue because you mentioned teams and perform, and we
Mm,
both have a common interest in rowing. And during
mm,
your tenure as chairman, the rowing club has enjoyed, Club of the Year in terms of
mm,
sport recognition, a good smattering of gold medals. And one of the things that interests me is, and of course, rowing isn't your only charitable
mm,
interest, the difference between motivating volunteers as
mm.
opposed to staff.
Yeah, it's interesting. So if you talk about the rowing club, so I took over, I was supposed to take over um, my sort of vice captaincy year, happened to happen during COVID and the club was
Mm,
shut. So when I took over at the Christmas of 2020, I've been involved, let's be clear, I've been involved in the rowing club committee for 8 years prior to that. So I understood how the club ran. But for me, I was like, well, how do we develop the club? So
mm,
first off, we just had to open the club and get going and do it safely. So that was first base. But then I thought, well, how do we develop the club? Financially, we're in a difficult state. The boat park was full. The most of the boat stock was old. There's some fundamental challenges, and I kind of broke the strategy down into four core streams of activity, which I could explain in a simple way. And I'll try it now. So I tried to get the promotional activity working because that had the longest burn and would have the biggest impact. We set out a program to raise money. We raised money to buy boats,
mhm.
new boats and of a pretty high standard, and then to reduce the barriers to entry, we hire them on a subscription basis. So a brand new quad would cost 16,000-17,000 pounds, which is a massive barrier to entry for anyone. But now they can be rented on a £5 per go basis or £15 a month. So for me, I took my knowledge outside of rowing of subscription models, which Netflix use, Spotify use, and thought, well, how can I apply it? And all the way through it, for me, it was just about how we get more people interested in rowing, get them integrated into rowing, and lower the barriers to entry. And I think if you have a very clear mindset of what you are trying to achieve, it becomes quite easy to communicate. And because it was about all of the club, it becomes a message that resonates with a lot of people. Um, and then it's about picking people who help you want to go on that journey with you. I was tremendously fortunate that we had an amazing sort of leadership team and committee that because you again have to work through other people.
Mhm.
um, and you all you can do with volunteers is ask them. Yeah, there's no stick to the carrot, but you are trying to achieve something with people's marginal time. And my view was, what could I contribute? Well, it wasn't. I'm not going to be a world class athlete. I'm 49. Um, I'm not going. I can't necessarily. I'm not a coach. So I can't get the current block of athletes to be better.
Mm.
But what I can do is I can build the infrastructure that enables other people to be better. And really, that was using my skills in a way that maybe relatively other people couldn't. And I let them then do the things they're interested in.
And I'm struck by um, now trying to Woodward, Supply Woodward's book,
Mm,
which is about bringing very often people try and bring sport disciplines into business. And
mm,
his book, okay, was actually about bringing business disciplines
yes.
into sport. And I'm hearing what you say and recognizing your skills as somebody who's run their own business and
Mm,
deploying those skills in a club. I mean, to what extent do you think, for example, charities would
mm.
benefit from better business training, business awareness? Or indeed, do you feel that they're even lacking that? Do you think actually charities are amazing because they can do things without necessarily having the funding and the products and the sales and the money?
So first of all, I think charities are generally amazing because they're typically volunteer run. They might have small budgets and things like that. So first off, my my reason for doing the work with the rowing club and some of the other things, it was about giving back to society. I've had tremendous pleasure from rowing. When I played hockey, I was on the association. I've refereed and things like that because I've always tried to give back to the communities that have supported me. I think that's important, and charities that are like that. The challenge you have with any volunteer run organization is that there will be a general lack of business skills by the nature of what of the organization they are. And I do think, because even a charity, it is a business. It provides services, it has resources, and although it doesn't need to necessarily make money, it does function like a business. It is raising money somehow. It is deploying those resources somehow. It has staff, it has scheduling, it has finances, it has auditing, it has compliance, it has mandatory reporting to the commission. All these sorts of things. So I actually believe business has a lot to teach sport, just as sport has a lot to teach business.
And that's an interesting one. I mean, as a former sports person myself, I like the metaphor that sport sells into business, but I often think it doesn't actually work. And the reason I often think it doesn't work is that you can take a bunch of athletes and say, we've got 52 weeks to win a gold medal, and for 52 weeks, I expect you to give your all, put everything in second place, focus on this one goal, be ruthlessly selfish. Okay, push everything to one side, train like hell, and we have a marginal chance of success. But of course, business is much more complicated than that. You don't have a singular goal. You don't have a limited time frame. It is more complicated, and I think more collaborative. You have many more.
So I agree, but I'll answer your question bottom up and top down. So bottom up, the act of choosing a goal. So one of the things that I actually coach on and talk to people about in their lives is the importance of being choiceful. To me, that's what are I call it my rule of 3.5 things. So what are the 3.5 things in your life that are really, really important to you that you are going to dedicate time to in order to achieve the contentment you are seeking in your life? And those things might change over time. You mentioned being an athlete, and then then you move on to other things. So if you take bottom up, as a business or as an athlete, picking a goal, working back, and then creating the environment and putting the time in to be successful is incredibly important. Whether you want to climb Kilimanjaro, there's one going around, I think, in September this year. Well, I think that's within my skill set, but in order to do it, I have to start getting fit now. I probably need a guide. I'm going to need some Sherpas to help me get up and down, because I'm what are the things I need to do and have around me in order to be successful? But in sport, you're focusing on the athletes performing. But I think if we go top down, people forget the environment around them that has enabled them to be selfishly successful in their own phrase. So to keep a sport analogy, you only have to look at Team GB, where it was in 1996 and where it got to in 2012, 16 and 20 to understand the impact of organization on success. And the phrase I would use is that even the strongest fish will die in a toxic tank. But if you can create an environment that is properly funded, good coaches, good infrastructure, good training facilities, if you can create an environment in which other people can perform, the actual organization has a bigger impact, arguably, than the athletes. A lot of part of winning gold medals is actually about a farming system to find talent. That's infrastructure, that's scouting, that's coaching. Yeah. Um, you know the whole stuff about the aggregation of marginal gains, the British cycling team, the analogy of peas and carrots, meat and carrots. So basically, their whole point was, yes, the aggregation of marginal gains was important, but they actually focused on the things that made a massive difference, not the things that made a small difference. The idea being, you can do an awful lot with the peas, but it doesn't really change the dish. If you make the steak better, you've had a great meal. So focus on the really, really big things. And some of them were simple, like traveling with your own pillow. So you always had a good night's sleep, and I find, sport again, but that's applying business to sport, and they put in the infrastructure and the funding needed to be successful.
One of the interesting things in my experience of sport, an area I'm curious on your feedback on, is the two sports that I was involved in quite heavily were triathlon and rowing, and both when they were very much an amateur. And triathlon now is a very professional sport, and it's an Olympic sport, and coastal rowing is about to become recognized and as an Olympic sport. And whilst it is really exciting to see that growth,
yes,
I have a slight sense of loss when we've lost our amateur status, because you talked about the improvement in British cycling. The improvement of British cycling partly came through a lot of money, a lot of professionalism, a new approach. And I worry about, I mean, I can see all the advantages, but I can actually see the disadvantages, how some people may feel disenfranchised as an enthusiastic amateur in any sport, sports, just generally.
So we actually discuss this a lot as a rowing club committee, because there's two elements. Keeping it simple, you have an element of younger, higher performing athletes, and you need to create an environment where they have the infrastructure to be more successful. Hence the boats, hence the coaching, hence the training. The other bit I focused on as well is always making sure there was trickle down benefit to the journeyman, to me. I'm not trying to win a gold medal. I'm just trying to get round the bay without dying. and get round the bay and enjoy my race, and enjoy my sport and enjoy my activity. But those two things can coexist. To have a high performing team, it doesn't necessarily need to be to the exclusion of the many. And in actual fact, I would argue in any sport, to have a high performing, relatively elite sort of group, the grassroots needs to be functioning.
How does
you see that in football.
How does that segue back into a conversation about businesses? I recollect a conversation by a long time ago, the chief executive of Barclays, and he said something along the lines of, I don't have 100% performers. My success comes from taking 60% performers and making them 65% performers. And of course, what you've articulated is almost a sort of a pyramid, a few select high performers and a really solid base. I mean, is that reflected in recruitment? Is that reflected in training, in development?
Yes.
How does that manifest itself in business?
So I quite like that sort of 60 to 65, because that's my sort of 100, getting everybody to be 5% better. So I that instantly resonates with me. And so people talk about a war for talent and things like this. And I think we have to keep in mind, we're not Silicon Valley. We're not got, £1 million salaries rippling through the business, right? So by our definition, to the point, we are, normal people doing a normal job and trying to do it a bit better. So for me, there is elements of recruitment, of course, but I focus on recruiting good people because good people who are engaged, who are doing work they're kind of interested in, and hopefully we're in a good environment, they will on average outperform their other self.
Mhm.
Yep. And the aggregate impact of 100, 200, 300 people slightly outperforming is huge if you think
Mhm.
about it. So, and again, if I think about people's careers, I focus on two things in four categories. First of all, the fundamentals. You have to do work you're interested in. So,
Mhm.
so my me as a boss, what is that? Secondly, you have to work with people you like working with, right? So again, as a boss, I focus on hiring people that we want to work with, and weeding out bad actors, so you keep the environment good. And then I think if you break it down, it's how do we create opportunities to develop self? How do we get opportunity to develop client relationships? Then how do we get an opportunity to develop um, the, your business function and then the company on a broader sense? So I try, I always ask those sort of simple questions, and I try to align people to their areas of relative interest. I mean, there's always there's always a bit of give and take because there's got to be a client need as well. But yeah, I try and line those things up as best I can. That nearly always leaves me a gap, and I recruit to the gap.
Mhm.
Yeah, I we do our best to recruit bottom up to give people the opportunity, because the impact of promoting, let's say, someone at level 6 means someone at level 5, level 4, level 3, level 2 and level 1 also have a chance to get promoted, and the net impact of that on organizational motivation is big. Yeah,
And
they seem
and
cool.
I'm interested in how, because if staff are your greatest asset and they are responsible for your product and
Yeah,
service, then we're really again talking supply side. When we then start looking at the demand side, what do customers demand? And I find that interesting because there are different arguments. I mean, certainly Zuckerberg's famous quote is done is better than perfect. There
I
is an
agree.
argument that says, good enough is good enough, and spending an extra 90% of funding to improve the product by 1% may not necessarily be the value that the customer is looking for.
Correct.
But then at the same time, we often hear about it has to be perfect quality, it has to be top of the range, etc. We celebrate the premium brands, a $20 watch will tell you the time, for example.
Yes.
So I'm just interested in your view on this productivity, price, value. And maybe your views have changed over time as you got involved in different organizations.
Yeah. Yes, but I think fundamentally the things I like, the companies I've gone towards and the jobs I've done are also kind of quite aligned to my values. So I spend an awful lot of time speaking to clients,
Mhm.
and one of my most fun parts of my job is helping my colleagues to innovate their proposition.
Mhm.
It sounds very grand, but it for me it's really, if we take a very simple, trying to make sure I don't give too much away.
Mhm.
We take a very simple thing. Um, we as a business are ISO 27001 qualified. That means every 3 years we have to go through a massive audit. To pass the audit, we've got a massive bunch of IT procedural documents that have been linked to configurations, etc., in our tech stack. It doesn't take a huge leap of faith to go, I can repurpose those documents for my client. I
Mhm.
have spent the money and the
Mhm.
time to create those good assets. I can easily then turn that into, for relatively low cost and relatively low time, I can turn that asset into an asset I can sell to my clients. And so now all of a sudden we've taken an internal cost, and now we're giving more value quicker to our clients, and we're giving them the confidence that what we're recommending and what we're configuring in their IT environment meets regulatory standards, meets GDPR, blah blah blah. That's enormously valuable. It doesn't sound very innovative, but it is. How do we bundle training into things? How do we have a 24/7, 365 service capability that was originally put in place for the banks. So we've got the cost. So my argument was, well, why don't we just give that to every client? That's enormously valuable to a medium business as well. And it's a quality barrier that most of my on island competitors are going to struggle to meet. So now I can give more value, more assurance for no incremental cost. That's quite powerful, and that's quite innovative.
And one of the themes that has emerged from this is almost that ability to take situations and turn them into products or services. I mean, a little earlier when you talk about the Rowing Club and you identified what needed to be done, there seemed to be this idea, well, we need to do these things and we need to raise this money to match this requirement. So it's this matching process. It's not pure leadership, let's go over here. It seems to be more creative, co-creative, collaborative, the sort of thinking process of how we stitch things together to add value.
So again, let's go back to my educational background and career. Very, very broad educational background, very broad career. I've always stayed on the business side of technology. But back in my early days, automating inward back feeds, dial-up banking, internet banking. I've done, I've worked in funds, I've worked in trust, I've worked in banks, I've worked in government departments. I've got uniquely, my weakness of not having a specialism is a strength, because I have a broad background and I'm able to apply learnings from area X to area B and create something that is of value. And also I take quite a game theoretic view to this. How do we create win-win-win scenarios? Because it's got to work for your partner, it's got to work for your business, and it's got to work for you. So how do we create how do we take learnings from other sectors, apply it to our situation so that we can go forwards? And that's quite a creative process, and I enjoy that, but I can only do it because I've got quite a broad background and reading list and things like that. So oddly, my broadness of my career, which I wondered whether it was a weakness for many, many years, is actually my strength and my sort of superpower.
And that's interesting, because what I take from this, and I may be wrong, is somebody who's really good at process, at joining the dots, at seeing the big picture, at taking information or experience from one industry or experience and applying it to another. And the reason that's quite interesting is, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but you come across as slightly, in that context, nerdy. Somebody who actually understands stuff. And yet one would often think of somebody who has set up and sold his own business and then grown and head of another business to be less process and more style, charisma, deal maker. Are you unusual, or have I misunderstood how things
No, I think maybe I am unusual. So I am an introvert, and it's one of those interesting things. I saw this post on LinkedIn that was talking about introverts and the powers they have, and the positive impact they can have on decision making and thinking. And then the very last tagline was, share this with another introvert in your life. And I went, no, that's wrong. Share it with the extrovert, so they just dial it down a bit sometimes. So I am a nerd. I do think things. I do come from do come from actually a bit of intellectual rigor. So one of the things I like doing, and I know this would led me into all sorts of interesting areas in my career, rowing, the equality work. If you have a good idea,
Mm-hmm.
it has to work top down.
Mm-hmm.
It also has to work bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
If the top down and the bottom up do not align, something's wrong and you need to change it. And what I've curiously been able to do is work out so well-meaning but misguided policies, which look right at first glance, but when you really, really think about them, will drive you to an inappropriate outcome. I have an uncanny knack of joining the dots of those things. And therefore, the opposite is true, joining the dots of things that could actually work. And I think if you get the incentives right at the grassroots level, and you add them all up and it gets to the outcome at a macro level, the outcome you want, and then you reverse it back down and it works both the organization and individual, you've probably got something extraordinarily powerful. And if you haven't got those two things joined up, you've got your thinking wrong somewhere and you need to just work on it a bit more. But yeah, I am an introverted person who's forced myself to get out of my comfort zone, do things like this, stand on stage. People don't realize, but I took a lot of public speaking courses to get better at this.
Mm-hmm.
I've done adverse media training so that I can handle hostile interviews. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I hope this isn't one.
No. But I think it's important to look forward and go, well, actually, in my job,
Mm-hmm.
I might actually need to do them. Something might crop up, and then equip myself today to handle that problem tomorrow. But I think fundamentally, back down, work top down and bottom up, and if you can get that right, you've got something very powerful.
Do you find, as somebody who can clearly deal with complexity, in fact, possibly even enjoy complexity,
Yes.
do you find yourself then frustrated when everyone's going for simplicity?
So simple is harder than complex, I think Steve Jobs said once. Because if you think about the strategy that I outlined for the rowing club, if you take it out of business, promotion, fundraising, buy vote, subscription model. Yeah. It's deceptively simple. There's an awful lot of context and understanding and thinking that's gone into that, because originally I had about 8 things, 9 things, 10 things, and I had to work on it because I didn't have it right. And that's why we didn't actually start talking about the strategy in the rowing club for 3 or 4 months, while we just focused on opening the club from COVID. But I was always working on it, talking to people, tinkering with things, trying to get it right. But when you've got it right and you can convey it in a simple way, that's when you can move mountains. Yeah. Making something simple is incredibly difficult.
And I'm pleased you said that, because I think sometimes when people take Steve Jobs and say, oh, it needs to be simple, they perhaps underestimate how complicated an iPhone, an iPad, or indeed
Yeah.
strategy really was. And actually, if you look at, say, the IBM PC, which is an assembly of parts that you could buy from Tandy and assemble yourself, the IBM PC was infinitely more simple than the Mac. So his mantra may have been simplicity from the point of view aesthetics, but it didn't
Yes.
undermine his ability to think complex thoughts.
Correct. And he hit it behind the scenes. But what I like, and again, talking about innovation, if you present people with a challenge, so we had one in our own business. We've got a proposition we put out, and 2 years ago, when we first debated it, how much is this going to cost the client? How long is it going to take? And it was the classic sort of, it'll be about £120,000. It'll take 6 or 7 months.
Mhm.
And I sat with the team and went, okay, that's not acceptable. It needs to cost the client probably less than 50, and it needs to be delivered in a week.
Wow. Mhm.
Yeah, like, so everybody does that. Everybody goes, what? And then you're going to go, right. People think I've got three heads now, right? Go, right, hear me out. In order for those two statements to be true, I deliver it in a week and halve the cost to the client. What needs to be true?
Mhm.
And then you start thinking very creatively about the assets you have in the company and what you can bring to bear. And one of my colleagues had consulted in the field for a long time, so we hire him. We put it,
Mhm.
we pick his brains to get 80-90% of the client requirements together. We get one of our teams to pre-build it. We all know the core applications in the trust industry. I can name them all off the top of my head. Well, let's pick one that we work with first. All of a sudden, we were able to do that, and a year, 18 months later, we can deliver it in 2.5 days. But to force somebody to think simply, you often have to go on a very difficult and complicated journey.
It definitely resonates with me. I can think of two examples of that. I think famously, Elon Musk said, look, we'll never be able to produce electric cars because batteries are too expensive. So let's just rethink how we do batteries. And when we resolve
Yeah.
that problem, we can now start thinking about electric cars. And I think it is that let's go backwards to fundamentals, okay, rather than start with the assumption we need to just buy cheaper batteries.
Yeah.
Say, well, what does it take to manufacture a battery, etc. And I certainly know from my own experience on certain projects, for example, Corporation of the Harbours and Airport and privatising public sector organisations, there isn't necessarily a run book for that. And so you do have to work with people to say, okay, well, the objective is this. There must be 1,000 ways of getting to that objective. Let's look at different combinations that will get us there, rather than that sort of bludgeon approach that says, we're going to do X. Maybe there are half a dozen variations on X, and some of them may be cheaper or faster or better.
And I think people, once you picked your goal, back to your sporting analogy, you go for it, right? I cannot overstate the importance of taking action
Mhm.
and then learning on the way. And
Mhm.
I don't mean fire things off willy-nilly, but really think about the target, what you're trying to achieve. Really think as best you can about the resources, the processes, the things that need to be in place in order to be able to get to the goal. Because you and I can't suddenly run up Kilimanjaro tomorrow. We'll die halfway up.
Mhm.
However, once you've got the goal and you've got the process and you think you've got the resources, just start.
But there's
You
something.
will learn 1,000 things on the way. Yeah.
And I absolutely agree with you. I use a row metaphor that says, look, if you're in the boat, okay, even if you're going in the wrong direction, you can correct the direction. If you're sat on the beach, there's nothing you can do. You're sat on the
Correct.
beach. And I use that analogy very often where organizations think the development of the strategy is sufficient and are really quite poor at execution. And I wonder sometimes whether we perhaps overvalue strategy and advice and undervalue implementation and actually getting things done.
So one of your sort of teaser questions, which I know we haven't gone through, but you talked about what's the one thing that frustrates you in the industry, and this is it, right? It's people overestimate what an organization can achieve in a year,
Mhm.
and they underestimate what it can achieve in 3, 4, 5 years of persistent effort. This belief that transformative change is easy, linear, without risk is daft,
Mhm.
right? But the act of mobilizing work, maybe deprioritizing other things, because
Mhm.
again, part of executing a strategy is agreeing what you're not doing. And I think that's just as important as agreeing what you're going to do, because you've got to make time, you've got to make space, you've got to reprioritize people. There might be a short-term, revenue impact to that, all of the difficult conversations, right? But mobilizing transformative work is slow and hidden initially. Yeah. It's like planting crops. You're planting in the end of the year for something to happen maybe next year. Yeah. And so some of those crops might grow, some of them might not. There might be some bumps and niggles along the way, but you've still got to plant the seeds today. And the cumulative impact of consistently working towards that transformative goal is enormous over time. It's like compound interest. People who change their strategy, each year, well, then you didn't have a strategy in the first place. But you can move mountains in 5 years. You can transform your life in 5 years. You can be in the worst place of your life, but if you diligently apply yourself, try to learn, try to get better, try to improve your life, try to improve your lot, try to remove negative influences from your life, that's transformative over 5 years. And it's no different really in business. But I think a bit more patience and realism in how long it takes people to make that change and mobilize that change is my biggest frustration.
And so as we sort of draw to a close, taking that frustration, taking those years on different areas, different experiences, different environments, what would be the advice that you would give to perhaps a young entrepreneur starting out?
First and foremost, work on something you're interested in and passionate about, and try and collate a group of people who share that passion, right? You can't do it all yourself, but you've got to know what you're trying to do. Yeah, because you can't communicate it otherwise. And then what I suggest is to go and do it, but also manage your downside risk, because it depends on who you're talking to. So it's dangerous. In my own situation, we set up our business. I'm 33 years old. I have one child, another on the way. And I convinced my wife, who's not working at the time, that I'm going to give up my job and go do this crazy thing and set up my own business. Now, to a lot of people, that sounds extraordinarily risky. On the flip side, I went into business with someone I trusted and knew. I went into business with someone who'd done it themselves. So they already knew how to do it. And I was the understudy, for want of a better word. So I felt my risk was mitigated a lot by the presence of Paul. I also knew that if the business failed, I could just go and get a job. So that was okay. And importantly, to sort out the money side, I found Paul actually found a breakaway engagement for me. I went and did it, took a risk, worked in Guernsey, I worked away from my young family for 2 years, but I banked every penny from that, so that when we went into business fully, I had a buffer. So if you think about all the things that could go wrong financially, organizationally, I felt I reasonably mitigated those risks. So when you go into the venture, whatever the venture that young person is, or middle-aged person is for that matter, how do you mitigate the downsides and then just get on and do it?
That is great advice. Stuart, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for being so
lovely to chat.
And thank you for that advice. I mean, I think I could take a good amount of that myself. So what a great podcast. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Tim. Lovely to chat.
Thanks.